On a quiet Sunday in small-town Tennessee, 4 children vanished from the world in the space of minutes, and the man responsible didn't run, didn't hide, and didn't deny a thing. Instead, he walked calmly into a police station and told officers exactly what he'd done. But what really unsettled the nation wasn't just why he committed the murders. It was the strange, almost chilling way he faced his punishment. And buried in the details of his final hours was a decision so rare it hadn't been seen in the state for nearly half a century. Welcome to Death Row Diaries. Hit the subscribe button so you'll never miss an update from us. Shelbyville, Tennessee. A town where Sundays usually meant church services, family dinners, and kids playing in their backyards. The air carried the faint scent of wood smoke as residents prepared for the chill of early winter. In one small workshop on the edge of town, the scent was different: motor oil, metal, and dust clinging to the air. That afternoon, 35-year-old Daryl Keith Holton gathered his children for what seemed like an innocent visit. Stephen was 12, curious, thoughtful, the kind of boy who asked endless questions about how things worked. Brent, 10, had an adventurous streak, always up for exploring. Eric, just 6, followed his older brothers everywhere, his laughter bright and unfiltered. And then there was Kayla, only 4 years old, shy but quick to smile when she felt safe. The workshop belonged to Holton's friend, Tom, who wasn't around that day. The building sat back from the road, partially hidden by trees, with a creaky wooden door that opened into a dim, cluttered space. To anyone passing by, it was just another weekend in Shelbyville. But inside those walls, Holton had something hidden. Something no one could have imagined. Against the back wall, behind an old mattress propped up like a divider, rested an SKS semi-automatic rifle. Holton had placed it there earlier, ensuring it would be ready when the moment came. The room was quiet, except for the occasional groan of the building settling in the wind. The children, unaware of what their father was planning, explored the space like any group of siblings might. It was the kind of setting that, if you didn't know the ending, might have felt unremarkable. And yet, in just a few minutes, this place would transform into the scene of a crime so cold-blooded, even seasoned investigators would struggle to make sense of it. Holton told the kids to follow him to the back room. They shuffled past the workbenches, stepping over coiled extension cords and old tires, until they reached the space behind the mattress. There, he told them to cover their eyes. He framed it like a game, something that might end with a surprise. But the surprise was the rifle he lifted into his hands. What happened next was brutally fast. Holton aimed and fired at his eldest son, Stephen, before turning the weapon on Brent, then Eric, and finally Kayla. The shots echoed sharply in the enclosed space, but outside the noise barely carried. Neighbors later told police they heard nothing, not even the sound of children crying. When it was over, the room went silent. The air smelled of gunpowder. Holton, still calm, stepped away from the bodies. He retrieved a police radio scanner from a nearby shelf and listened for any chatter about gunshots in the area. There was none. He returned to the children's bodies, dragging them into a corner and covering them with a tarp. It wasn't an act of remorse or respect. It was more like tidying up a task. On a nearby table sat materials for homemade bombs. He had wired explosives to small containers with enough firepower to cause significant destruction. His initial plan, it would later be revealed, was to drive to a nearby location and target more victims, possibly his ex-wife's family. But in a sudden shift, he abandoned that part of the plan. Instead, he made a choice that stunned investigators. He got in his car and drove straight to the police station. It was early evening when Holton walked through the glass doors of the Shelbyville Police Department. Officers on duty looked up, expecting maybe a report of a minor crime or a request for assistance. Instead, they were met with 3 words, spoken flatly and without emotion. Homicide, 4 victims. He didn't stumble over the words. He didn't cry. He simply stated them, like a man giving his name. The officers, caught off guard, asked him to explain. He told them that the victims were his own children, and that he had just shot them in the workshop. In the minutes that followed, Holton recounted the crime step by step, his tone disturbingly even. He gave directions to the scene, described where he'd left the rifle, and even mentioned the tarp covering the bodies. A patrol unit was dispatched immediately. When they arrived, they found the children exactly as Holton had described. 4 small bodies under a tarp in the dim back corner of the workshop. The SKS rifle lay nearby. The homemade explosives were still there, untouched since Holton left. One officer later said that what made the scene so haunting wasn't just the violence, it was the unnatural quiet of the room, as though the chaos had been vacuumed out of it. Back at the station, Holton waived his right to an attorney in those initial hours, preferring to speak directly to investigators. He didn't try to justify his actions with anger, jealousy, or even insanity. When asked why, his answers were vague, almost mechanical. This calmness, this almost robotic acceptance of what he'd done, would become one of the central questions of his trial. Was this a man acting in a moment of irrational rage, or was it something far colder? If you're finding this story as chilling as I am, hit that like button and let me know what you think in the comments below. By June of 1999, the case of State of Tennessee versus Daryl Keith Holton was underway in Bedford County. The prosecution came prepared with a straightforward narrative. This was premeditated murder. The rifle had been hidden in the workshop ahead of time. The children were lured there under false pretenses. The shots were deliberate. The defense had little to work with. They argued that Holton had been deeply depressed and emotionally unstable in the months leading up to the murders. His relationship with his ex-wife had deteriorated, and he felt increasingly disconnected from his children's lives. Psychiatric experts testified that he was suffering from major depressive disorder and a sense of hopelessness that had clouded his judgment. But the prosecution countered with forensic evidence, Holton's own confession, and the chilling fact that he had prepared explosives, a sign, they said, that he was thinking clearly enough to plan further acts. Holton himself didn't fight the charges. He didn't plead for mercy, didn't break down in court. The jury took note of his flat demeanor, the same unsettling calm he had shown during his confession. When the verdict came back, guilty on all 4 counts of first-degree murder, Holton stood still, showing no visible reaction. The sentencing phase was brief. The jury imposed the ultimate punishment, death by electrocution or lethal injection at the prisoner's choice. For most death row inmates, this is where the legal battle begins. Years, sometimes decades of appeals and motions to delay execution. But for Daryl Keith Holton, the decision was already made. And in the years that followed, he would take a path almost no one in his position ever chooses. Holton arrived at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville, Tennessee in 1999, where Tennessee's male death row population was housed. Death Row at Riverbend was a world unto itself, a narrow corridor of cells, each holding a man convicted of the state's most serious crimes. The days were monotonous but heavily regulated. 3 meals a day, an hour of recreation outside the cell, occasional access to a small law library. Many inmates found purpose in appealing their cases, writing letters to attorneys, and searching for new legal loopholes. Holton, however, showed no such interest. He filed only the appeals required by law, and when those were denied, he told his attorneys he didn't want to pursue anything further. Other inmates described him as quiet, polite, and withdrawn. He didn't join in conversations in the common area and rarely reacted to the frequent outbursts from others down the row. In interviews with prison staff, Holton expressed no remorse, but also no anger, only a kind of fatalistic acceptance. He said more than once that he had done what he intended to do and that it was time to face the consequences. This attitude put him in sharp contrast with almost every other death row inmate in the country. The vast majority fight their executions tooth and nail, not necessarily because they expect to win, but because survival, even inside a prison cell, is instinct. Holton seemed to lack that instinct entirely. If you're finding this story as chilling as I am, hit that like button and let me know what you think in the comments below. By 2006, with his legal options exhausted, Holton's execution date was set. Tennessee hadn't carried out an electrocution in over 46 years, and state law allowed prisoners to choose between lethal injection and the electric chair. Holton's choice would shock the public almost as much as his crime. When given the official form to select his method of execution, Holton didn't hesitate. He checked the box for electrocution. This was not a symbolic protest, not a legal maneuver to delay the process. In fact, it accelerated it. Prison officials and reporters were baffled. Lethal injection was the modern method, considered, at least on paper, less painful, less visibly violent. The electric chair was a relic, a heavy oak seat with leather straps, a metal headpiece, and the history of gruesome, botched executions. Why would a man willingly choose it? Holton offered no elaborate explanation. He told one journalist that lethal injection seemed too clean, too clinical. The electric chair, he said, was certain. Some speculated it was his final act of control. In a process where almost every choice had been taken from him, this was one decision that was entirely his. Tennessee had kept its electric chair operational for historical and legal reasons, but few thought it would ever be used again. Now, for the first time since 1960, prison staff began preparing it for an execution. The announcement made headlines across the country. Victims' rights advocates applauded the lack of delay. Death penalty opponents condemned it as barbaric, but Holton himself avoided the noise entirely, declining nearly every interview request in his final months. On the morning of September 11, 2007, Holton awoke in his death row cell for the last time. Prison protocol for an execution day was precise: extra security, restricted movement, and constant observation. His last meal was simple: cheeseburger, mashed potatoes, baked beans, and coleslaw. He didn't request alcohol, dessert, or any exaggerated items. Throughout the day, guards noted that his demeanor was unchanged, calm, almost indifferent. He spent part of the afternoon reading, and at one point, he briefly spoke with a chaplain. Witnesses said it wasn't a conversation about forgiveness or repentance. Rather, it was more like two acquaintances making small talk. By evening, the execution chamber had been prepared. The electric chair sat in the center of the room. Polished oak, thick leather straps at the wrists, ankles, chest, and forehead. Above the seat hung the metal headpiece with its copper contact plate, connected by thick cables to a control panel behind a wall. At 1 a.m., Holton was escorted from his holding cell to the chamber. He walked without resistance, flanked by officers on either side. In the witness room, separated by glass, sat a small group: reporters, state officials, and relatives of the victims. Holton did not look at them. He did not offer final words. When asked if he wished to speak, he simply shook his head. The straps were secured, the headpiece lowered, and a wet sponge was placed between his scalp and the metal plate, standard procedure to ensure conductivity. At 1:10 a.m., the warden gave the signal. A surge of 1,750 volts shot through Holton's body for 20 seconds, followed by a second and third jolt. His body tensed violently against the restraints, and then fell limp. After a brief pause, a prison doctor entered to check for a heartbeat. At 1:25 a.m., Daryl Keith Holton was pronounced dead. The first person executed in Tennessee's electric chair in nearly half a century. In the days following the execution, public reaction was divided. Some residents of Shelbyville felt a sense of closure, believing justice had finally been served for the 4 young lives lost. Others felt that Holton's execution, especially by electric chair, was a grim spectacle that brought no real healing. Legal scholars noted that Holton's case was unusual in several ways. He confessed immediately after the murders. He waived most of his appeals, effectively volunteering for execution. He chose electrocution, reviving a method long considered obsolete. His decision not to fight his sentence raised questions about mental competency, even though court evaluations had found him fit to proceed. Death penalty opponents pointed to the case as an example of how the system can carry out executions without addressing deeper psychological issues. For Tennessee, the case became a historical marker, proof that the electric chair was still a legal option, and a reminder of how rarely such executions occur in the modern era. For the families of Stephen, Brent, Eric, and Kayla, the end of Holton's life did not erase the loss or the horror of what happened that Sunday afternoon in 1997. And for the rest of us, the case remains one of those rare instances where a killer not only accepts his fate, but chooses the path to it, a final, unsettling act of control in a life defined by violence and detachment.